I stood at the entrance of that underground chamber, and what I saw made me fall to my knees. 500 women. 500. The air that rushed out of the opening, a heavy, stagnant breath from the earth's depths, was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and hopelessness. It was a smell that choked the soul, a visceral, rotting scent that clung to the damp walls of the tunnel I had just crawled through. My legs, scraped raw from the frantic, desperate scramble to escape my pursuers, refused to hold me up, and I collapsed onto the cold, hard-packed earth of the cavern floor. I had expected a hidden compound. I had expected a prison. But this was an underground city of sorrow, a cruel parody of life, dug into the very bowels of the forbidden forest. The light from my small, flickering palm oil lamp danced across the vast space, revealing the impossible truth. It wasn't just a room, it was a sprawling catacomb, an enormous excavation beneath the surface of the world. Pillars of rough-hewn rock supported the low ceiling, creating aisles that stretched into the impenetrable darkness. Every corner, every shadow, held a human being. Young girls, teenagers, women in their 20s, the stolen daughters of Yazumura, and countless other forgotten villages, all living like prisoners in a place that shouldn't exist. There was no sound of conversation, only a low, collective moan, the sound of grief that had solidified over years into a permanent humming despair. I counted them with my hunters. A skill honed by years of tracking herds through thick bush. Not 100, not 200, 500. The sheer volume of human suffering was an assault on my sanity. Each face was a story, a family shattered, a future annihilated. Some were pregnant, their bellies straining against the thin, dirty wrappers they wore. They sat on rough mats, their eyes tracking the movement of my lamp with a dull, practiced caution, the eyes of a trapped animal. Some were carrying babies, infants, toddlers, children no older than 5, small, silent souls born into a lie, their first air breathed in this subterranean tomb. The tiny, whimpering cries were the most damning evidence of all. Others were simply crying, not the violent theatrical sobs of fresh grief, but the slow, silent streaming of tears that never stopped, tears that had washed away all hope, leaving behind only the grit of chronic pain. They sat huddled together for warmth and comfort, forming small, desolate islands in the cold, cavernous space. And in the corner of that dark, horrible place, dominating the meager light of a flickering fire pit, I saw him. The priest, the man our village thought was dead, the man we had mourned 10 years ago, whose sealed coffin we had lowered into the ground with tears of respect and piety. Akbara, he was alive. He was sitting on a carved wooden stool, eating a piece of roasted fowl, completely unconcerned by the desolate human landscape surrounding him. He was fatter than I remembered, his face shining with the grease of good living, his movements lazy and entitled. The ritual scars on his forehead, which once symbolized spiritual devotion, now looked like the brand of a butcher. He was the monster behind everything. He hadn't died. He had simply relocated his throne to hell. My name is Ahmad. I'm a hunter from Yazumura village, and I need to tell you this story before another community falls into the same trap we did. My initial glimpse into that chamber was the final devastating piece of a puzzle I had spent a decade trying to solve. For 15 years, my people lived in fear of a god that didn't exist, a phantom deity created by the greed of one man. For 15 years, we sacrificed our daughters, our sisters, our young women to a river that demanded blood. For 15 years, we believed we had no choice but to feed the beast. But it was all a lie. The biggest, cruelest lie ever told. And the man who told it used our fear, our faith, and our traditions, the very anchors of our existence, to build himself a kingdom of stolen women and broken families. By the time I discovered the truth, over 600 girls had been taken. The women in the cave were the survivors. Another 100 had simply vanished into the jungle over the years, either succumbing to the harsh conditions, disease, or the mental strain. Some were never seen again. And the ones I found that day, the ones I rescued, they were so traumatized, so damaged, that many of them never fully recovered. This is the story of how one evil man used religion to destroy an entire generation, and how I almost died trying to stop him. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the year 2005, right before the curse first started to poison our lives. I was just 12 years old then, a small boy learning the ancient, sacred art of tracking and hunting from my father, Musa, one of the most respected hunters in our district. Izumura was a peaceful place, a sprawling, happy farming community in the heart of Delta State. Our houses, built of sun-dried mud bricks and thatched with thick palm fronds, clustered comfortably around the central market square, beneath the protective shade of the enormous Irako tree. Our world was defined by the deep green curtain of the surrounding thick forests and the wide, fast-flowing river that gave our village its name, the Izumura River. This river was more than just a source of water and fish. It was the artery of our life, the embodiment of our local deity. We called the spirit of the river Mamandiomi, Mother of the Waters. Our elders taught us a history of respectful partnership. The god protected our land, moderated the rains, and gifted us the fertile alluvial soil that allowed us to grow our yam, cassava, and corn crops with minimal effort. In those years, life was simple, hardworking, and profoundly satisfying. The rhythm of Izumura was dictated by the agricultural calendar, planting, weeding, harvesting, and the festivals that punctuated the seasons. We had a strong sense of community, a vibrant culture where shared labor and shared joy were the norm. Evenings were filled with the sound of drums, the stories of the ancestors, and the laughter of children playing under the moonlight. There was poverty, certainly, but it was a shared, dignified poverty compensated by the richness of our relationships. Our faith was central, and at its head was Priest Akbara. Akbara was then a man in his mid-50s, robust, with a deep, resonant voice that seemed to carry the weight of the ages. He had been the chief priest for over 20 years, inheriting the role from his own father. He was a master of ritual, his movements precise, his incantations flawless. When he spoke of Mamandiomi, he did so with the reverence of a devoted son, and we believed him implicitly. Every year, during the dry season, we would offer sacrifices to the river. Small, symbolic gifts of cola nuts, calabashes of fresh palm wine, the finest goat from the herd, or the largest yams from the harvest. These were offerings of gratitude, not appeasement. The river god was happy with these gifts, and in return our harvests were good, our children were healthy, and our village prospered. Akbara oversaw these ceremonies with humble pride, reinforcing the gentle covenant between the people and the water spirit. He was not a king, he was a servant. The Izumura River itself was a character in our lives, wide and powerful. Its current ran with a dark, rich energy, carrying the silt of the interior down to the coast. It was our boundary, our highway, and our lifeblood. On the opposite bank lay the forest, untamed, deep, and known only as the Iziomi, the river's back or sacred forest. For generations, tradition held that this forest was the deep, spiritual preserve of the river god, where the spirits rested and the true, untamed power of nature resided. No one ever crossed the river into Iziomi, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was a natural law, a tradition as old as the Irako tree itself. My father, Musa, taught me that respect was the highest form of worship. The gods take care of us, he'd say, sharpening my first proper hunting knife. We give them our best and they give us peace. That is the balance. In 2005, Izumura lived in this balance. The people were resilient, their faith was strong, and the foundation of their lives was truth. They had no idea that a poison had already begun to work in the heart of their spiritual guide, that the man who claimed to protect the balance was already planning to shatter it and build his own personal empire from the resulting pieces. The seeds of wickedness were sown in Akbara's soul, nurtured by unchecked pride and a terrifying sudden lust for power and control. The change came not as a slow, creeping shadow, but as a violent, immediate storm. It was late into the harvest season, a night of peaceful exhaustion and full bellies, when the routine serenity of Izumura was ripped apart. I remember the sound first, a high-pitched, hysterical wail, unlike any human cry I had ever heard, followed by frantic, heavy footsteps. Our peaceful sleep was shattered. Akbara, the village priest, came running into the village square screaming. He was not wearing his usual calm, flowing white linen robes. Instead, he was wrapped in sackcloth, his body smeared with the black mud of the riverbank, and his face was contorted in a mask of genuine, terrifying panic. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and been driven mad by what he saw. Fire, disease, death? He shrieked, his powerful voice cracking with manufactured terror. The god has turned. The river god is angry. The immediate reaction was not skepticism, but dread. In our culture, when the man who speaks for the gods appears truly afraid, the people feel a primordial, paralyzing fear. Akbara didn't just speak the message, he embodied the terror. He gathered the entire village that night under the big Irako tree in the center of the square. The moonlight was swallowed by gathering clouds, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. His eyes, usually wise and placid, were now wild, rolling in their sockets. His voice shook with an engineered tremor, and he spoke with the kind of immediate life-or-death urgency that made everyone's feet root to the ground. "The river god is angry," he repeated, his voice dropping to a theatrical, terrified whisper, then exploding back into a shout. "Very angry. He came to me in a vision tonight, a vision of fire and brimstone, of destruction and ruin." Akbara began describing the supposed vision in vivid, agonizing detail. He described the river turning to blood, our fishing canoes capsizing, the water itself refusing to flow. He painted images of our future. He showed me fire consuming our village, our homes reduced to ash, our ancestors' shrines desecrated. He showed me our children dying of strange diseases, their skin turning yellow, their breath failing, their small bodies shriveling to dust. He showed me our crops failing, the earth spitting out our seeds, our yam mounds rotting the ground, our land turning to dust under a merciless, drought-ridden sun. The performance was masterful. Akbara had studied his people for decades. He knew precisely which images would generate the most profound, incapacitating fear: the death of children, the failure of the harvest, and the turning away of the protective deity. And he told me why. Akbara wailed, dropping to his knees. He said, "We have been taking from the river for too long without giving him what he truly desires. Our small gifts of yams and goats are insults to his majesty. He needs something pure, something of life." The crowd was silent, a collective mass of held breath. Fear had replaced logic. No one questioned why the god had suddenly changed his mind after generations of peace. No one remembered the history of respectful partnership. They only heard the threat. Then a brave voice from the back, an elder named Namdi, stuttered the crucial question: "What does the river god truly want from us, Akbara? Tell us the price of our survival." Akbara paused. This was the moment of the grand reveal, the pivot point of the deception. He rose slowly, his mud-caked body trembling, his shadow stretching long and monstrous in the lamplight. He looked around at all of us, allowing the silence to draw out the tension to breaking point. Then he spoke the words that would change our village forever, words that sealed the fate of hundreds of innocent lives. "The river god demands 10 pure maidens every 4 months. A ripple of disbelief, a gasp of horror, ran through the crowd, quickly silenced by the depth of the collective shock. "Girls who have never known a man," Akbar continued, his voice now a chilling, non-negotiable decree. "Girls between the ages of 18 and 25. They must be presented to the river as brides for the god. If we fail to do this, the god will wipe Uzumara from existence. Every man, woman, and child will perish. 10 girls? Every 4 months? 30 girls a year? Where would they find so many pure girls? What would happen to them? Would they die?" The confusion and shock quickly erupted into raw protest. Mothers began to cry out. Fathers shouted their refusals. Akbar raised his hand, not in a plea, but in command. "The girls will not die," he shouted over the din. "They will be taken across the river into the sacred forest, the Easy Iomi, where the god resides. There, they will become his brides and live in his kingdom. It is a great honor. These girls will be saving our entire village from destruction. They will be revered as our protectors." He gave them a choice, but it was no choice at all. Sacrifice 10 daughters or lose every single child and the entire community. But the villagers still hesitated. The lie was too big, the demand too brutal. Akbar knew this. He needed an unchallengeable sign. "You doubt the words of the gods," he bellowed, his voice pure fury. "You question the will of Mamandiomi? Then let the god speak for himself." Akbar performed a ritual right there in the village square. He threw a handful of white chalk into the air, knelt down, and began to chant a deep, guttural incantation. It was a language no one understood, a sequence of sounds that felt ancient and terrifying. And as he finished his final, piercing cry, the sky turned dark. It wasn't just a cloud, it was an instantaneous, unnatural gloom. Thunder roared with the sound of 1,000 logs splitting. A violent, cyclonic wind swept through the village, a localized burst of chaos that Akbar must have timed or somehow manufactured with his secret compound accomplices. The wind ripped the thick, palm frond roofs off several smaller huts, snapped branches off the Irako tree, and scattered the belongings of the terrified people. People screamed and ran for cover, thinking the end of the world had arrived. My own father grabbed me and pulled me into our hut, his face pale, with horror. The wind howled for less than 5 minutes, but the psychological damage was absolute. When the storm stopped, silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Everyone was convinced. The river god was real. The curse was real, and they had to obey or face total destruction. Akbar had sealed his lie with a terrifying, undeniable spectacle. He had turned an entire village into his willing, terrified hostages. The month that followed the announcement was the longest, darkest month Uzumura had ever known. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a mixture of overwhelming grief and paralyzing fear. No one slept soundly. Every shadow seemed to hold the judgmental stare of an angry god. The village elders, the council that traditionally governed our community, became Akbar's willing enforcers. They were as terrified as everyone else and believed their compliance was the only path to survival. Their first task was impossible. Compile a list of 10 pure maidens between 18 and 25. The list-making was a public ordeal, tearing the fragile fabric of trust in the community. Mothers swore their daughters were too young or too old or not pure. But the list had to be made. The first offering happened precisely 1 month later, under a chilling, pale sun. 10 girls from our village, all of them virgins, all of them young and beautiful, the flower of our rising generation, were dressed in white burial wrappers, a cruel mockery of a bridal gown. Their families had washed them, oiled their skin with palm kernel oil, and decorated them with beads, preparing them not for a wedding, but for a surrender. I was there that day, a wide-eyed 12-year-old standing with my father, watching the procession. I remember one girl, Adana, her hair braided with cowrie shells. She was 18, known for her bright, infectious laughter. On that day, her face was wet with tears, her eyes pleading with a silent desperation that haunts me still. Her mother collapsed onto the dusty earth, screaming a name that was lost in the general moan of the crowd. Akbar, however, was transformed. He wore his pristine white robes again, holding a staff carved with the symbol of a roaring fish. His panic was gone, replaced by a calm, authoritative solemnity. He spoke with gravitas about the great honor being bestowed upon these girls, about their patriotism and the immense blessing they were bringing to Uzumura. He was leading lambs to slaughter, yet he convinced the shepherds that he was guiding them to the highest pasture. He led the girls to the riverbank. They were forced one by one into a long, beautifully carved canoe, a vessel usually reserved for the annual festival of the Yam. Akbar and 3 village elders, their faces grim but resolute, took the paddles. I watched as the canoe moved away from our bank, carrying away the hope and joy of 10 families. Adana looked back, her eyes meeting her mother's across the widening gap of dark water, a silent farewell that contained all the pain in the world. They disappeared into the forest on the other side, swallowed by the ominous green. We never saw them again. The village mourned for weeks. The drumming was silent. The songs were hushed. Mothers cried for their daughters until their eyes were red and swollen. Fathers locked themselves in their homes, unable to eat or sleep, wrestling with the guilt of having purchased their own survival with their children's freedom. But Akbara, speaking through his appointed representatives, who were now given greater authority, assured us that the girls were safe. They are now living with the river god in his sacred kingdom, he proclaimed. They are queens blessed by the water spirit, and their sacrifice has saved us all. The curse has lifted. Yazumara is safe. And life went on. But it was a diminished life, a life lived under a persistent gray sky of anxiety. For months later, the demand came again. The atmosphere shifted from grief to a sick, anticipatory dread. The same brutal process unfolded. The agonizing list, the weeping farewells, the departure into the forbidden forest. This was the beginning of the grinding repetition, the true psychological weapon Akbara employed. Fear, when constant, doesn't paralyze, it becomes a routine. The extraordinary demand became the new ordinary. Every 4 months, the cycle renewed, turning the calendar into an instrument of torture. By the time I was 15, 3 years into the curse, over 90 girls had been taken. The village changed physically. Empty houses stood scattered among the occupied ones, their mud walls beginning to crumble, their thatched roofs turning into nests for birds. Young men started leaving. Where are they supposed to find wives? The marriageable women were vanishing into the easy Iomi, and the remaining girls were too young. This exodus further weakened the community, leaving behind the most vulnerable and the most tradition-bound. Families that remained were living in a state of chronic low-grade fear and profound, accumulated grief. The collective trauma was manifesting in strange ways. The traditional nightly drumming and storytelling ceased. The only sound was the distant rush of the river, which no longer sounded like a benevolent protector, but a hungry, constant roar. Neighbors began to eye each other with veiled resentment. The selection process created deep rifts. Families with sons began to resent families with daughters, whose sacrifices ensured the community's safety. While the village withered, Akbara, the messenger of the suffering god, seemed to flourish. His house was expanded with superior timbers. His clothes were of finer cloth. He received gifts from desperate families, hoping to influence the selection process. He justified it all as necessary to maintain the purity of his role. His prosperity was visible. Yet the villagers, trapped by fear, rationalized it as the deserved reward for his heavy burden of communicating with the volatile god. By 2013, 10 years after the curse began, over 200 girls had been taken. 200. Our village, which used to have over 3,000 people, had shrunk to less than 1,500. The vibrancy bled out of it, replaced by a gray resignation. This extended period of institutionalized fear led to the next, most tragic stage of the community's degradation. The pool of virgins began to run out. Parents became desperate, moving beyond mere grief to proactive, survivalist measures. They realized that the rule was the only thing that mattered, not the spirit of the rule. Families started marrying their daughters off as soon as they turned 16, sometimes even 15. These were not unions of love, but acts of preemptive defense. The girls were sacrificed to early, unwanted marriages to save them from being sacrificed to the river god. They were eligible for marriage, and thus no longer pure, before they could be eligible for the offering. This had devastating social consequences. Girls were robbed of their childhood, and young men were forced into financial commitments they couldn't afford, further destabilizing the family structure. The ultimate act of moral and spiritual capitulation began to happen. Some parents, driven mad by the prospect of losing a daughter, encouraged them to sleep with men deliberately before the selection date. The rationale was simple: a defiled daughter was a surviving daughter. They were using the very mechanism of human degradation to defeat the gods' demand. I remember one particular incident, the Chioma story, which shook the entire village and finalized my journey from questioning child to disillusioned adult. Chioma was 18 years old, beautiful, with eyes that held the warm, deep brown color of rich earth. She was the only surviving child of her mother, Amaka, a widow who had already lost two older daughters, Ngozi and Ijeoma, to the river god in the early cycles of the curse. Amaka's sanity was a threadbare shawl, held together only by the fierce, protective love for Chioma. Chioma was her last breath of hope, her last claim to a future. Chioma's name was called for the next offering in the 12th cycle. When the elder announced the list, Amaka did not cry. She simply walked out of the square, her movements slow, deliberate, the movement of a soul leaving a body. 3 days later, Amaka did the unthinkable. She went to the village square, not to protest the curse, but to fight the condition. She stood under the Irako tree at noon, stripped of her dignity, wearing only a tattered piece of cloth. She did not beg Akbara. She knew he was unreachable. She begged the young men of the village. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle, her hands clasped in a gesture of ultimate humility. "Please, save my daughter. One of you. Any of you. Take her virginity. Do this shameful thing for the love of my house. Defile her, so the river god cannot claim her." It was the most heartbreaking, most degrading thing I had ever witnessed. I was 20 years old then, standing with a group of my peers, the shame of being a man in that moment an unbearable weight. I saw grown women on their knees, crying, pleading with men to commit an act that in any other context would be seen as a violation, all to save their daughters from a greater, institutionalized violation. Some men refused, citing the deep cultural shame, saying it was wrong and would only bring another kind of curse. But others, their faces tight with pity and obligation, agreed. They saw it not as an act of lust, but as a terrible, ugly act of necessary mercy. That night, several girls, including Chioma, lost their virginity, not to husbands they loved, not in the context of marriage and family, but in a desperate, clinical attempt to escape a god that demanded their very essence. Chioma was saved from the river god's list, but the price was her soul. She was never the same again. The trauma of the sacrifice, the violation, the shame, the profound disgust she felt towards herself and towards the men who had touched her, destroyed her from the inside out. Her laughter was gone. Her eyes held the same empty stare I would later see in the cavern. 3 months later, she walked into the Uzumura River, weighted her clothes with stones, and drowned herself. She chose the real death in the river over the living death of her shame. Amaka, her mother, found her body floating near the bank, the white water lilies clinging to her clothes like mocking funeral blossoms. Amaka went completely mad from grief, spending her final year screaming Chioma's name at the Irako tree before she too died, a victim of the curse, though not of the river itself. This was the reality of life in Uzumura. A village trapped in a cycle of fear, sacrifice, and death, every moral structure collapsing under the weight of Akbara's lie. I couldn't endure it anymore. The death of Chioma, the visible, tangible evidence of a community destroying its own values to survive, broke the fear in me and replaced it with a cold, righteous fury. I started asking questions that were becoming an act of treason in Uzumura. Why did the river god suddenly change his demands after all these years of gentle communion? Why did he only speak to Akbara and no one else? Was the god now a personal pet of the priest? Why were the girls never seen again? Not even their bodies, not even their spirits visiting in dreams, which was common in our spiritual tradition. And most importantly, why did Akbara, the priest who claimed to be serving the gods and suffering the most, seem to be getting fatter, richer, and more powerful while the rest of the village was dying? His children were well-fed, well-clothed, and seemingly immune to the collective sorrow. I share my doubts with my father, Musa, one night. He didn't slap me. He was older, sadder, and his faith was now built on quicksand. But he did threaten me. "Ahmad," he whispered, his voice broken, Never question the gods. Never question the priest. You will bring a curse upon our family, and the entire village will turn against us. But I couldn't stop questioning. Something didn't feel right. Something about this whole situation smelled like a lie, a stench of corruption hidden behind the perfume of ritual. The hunter in me, the one trained to notice the misplaced leaf, the unnatural break in the bush, knew that the evidence did not support the story. And I decided I was going to find out the truth, even if it killed me. The village continued its slow, agonizing decay until 2015, 10 years after the curse began, when the next great manipulation took place. Akbara, the village priest, suddenly died. Or, at least, that's what we were told. His immediate family announced that he had passed away in his sleep. The official story was that the strain of communicating with the angry god had finally broken his heart. The village reacted with a mixture of immense relief and profound fear. Relief that the messenger of the terrible god was gone, perhaps ending the curse. Fear that without their mediator, the river god would simply wipe them out instantly. The village held a massive funeral for him, the largest and most expensive ritual event in years. We mourned him, honored him as the man who had, for a decade, been the sole bridge between us and destruction. But I didn't believe Akbara was dead. I had seen him 3 days before his supposed death. He was supervising the repair of his fence, shouting orders at laborers, his chest massive, his voice booming. He looked perfectly healthy, strong, not like a man about to die, but a man about to live for another 30 years. And then there was the coffin. During his funeral, the coffin was sealed shut. Akbara's sons and remaining family claimed that tradition demanded the body of a high priest who communicated with a water deity had to be sealed to prevent his spirit from being trapped in the water. This was an absolute fabrication of tradition. In Uzumura, the viewing of a respected elder's body was a sacred duty, essential for the ancestors to recognize and receive the soul. A sealed coffin was highly unusual, suspicious, and to my trained eye, the final piece of evidence that this was a fraud. I tried to voice my suspicions to Musa and a few other younger men. They dismissed me instantly. Ahmad, stop. You insult the dead. You seek to bring the gods' wrath on all of us. They said I was being disrespectful, blinded by my hatred for the priest. My anger had isolated me. I fell silent, but my investigation intensified. A new priest was appointed, a younger, nervous man named Emeka. Emeka was a devout man, terrified of the river god, and completely subservient to Akbara's 2 grown sons, who had suddenly taken on the roles of ritual advisors to the new, inexperienced priest. Emeka continued the offerings to the river god, just as Akbara had done. The cycle of dread did not break. The disappearance of Akbara did nothing to halt the flow of victims. This proved 2 things to me. The curse was an ongoing, active enterprise regardless of who was playing the role of the messenger. Akbara's sons and key family members were involved in the conspiracy and were now running the operation. They had kept the secret and were now profiting from their father's wicked legacy. I became obsessed with finding out the truth. I began spending every spare moment in the forest, tracking, observing, listening. As a hunter, I knew the forest better than anyone else in the village. I knew the paths, the sounds, the patterns of animals, the shift in the wind. I understood the language of the bush, and I started noticing something strange, something I had ignored for years, dismissing it as the natural sound of the deep forest. Every 4 months, right after the girls were taken across the river, I would hear sounds coming from deep within the forbidden forest, the Easy Iomi. Sounds of people talking, not ghostly moans, but human voices. Sounds of children crying, not the spirit cries of lost souls, but the clear, demanding wail of infants. Sounds of life, the faint, distant thump of an axe hitting wood, the smell of wood smoke carried on a favorable wind, the high-pitched giggle of a woman. Sounds of life where tradition dictated there should only be silence and the solitary presence of a vengeful god. The forest on the other side of the Uzumura River was forbidden. Akbara had declared it sacred ground, the dwelling place of the river god, and anyone who violated it would be struck dead immediately. For 10 years, everyone had obeyed this rule out of fear. But I decided I was going to break it. The lie had cost my community 200 lives and the soul of another 100. The time for fear was over. The time for the hunt had begun. I was going to cross that river and find out what was really happening to those girls. My preparation for the crossing was meticulous, a task requiring the utmost secrecy. I could not afford to be seen. If I was caught, I would not only face execution for blasphemy, but I would confirm Akbar's lie to the villagers, ensuring that their fear would never break. I spent weeks studying the river's current, the specific angle of the moon, and the patrol patterns of the few elders who still monitored the riverbank. I told no one about my plan, not even my father. The truth was too heavy a burden for anyone else to carry, especially a man crippled by grief and fear. I packed light, my kit reduced to the essentials of survival and confrontation. My father's old hunting knife, honed to a razor edge, a tool of silent necessity. A long, tightly woven rope for climbing or binding. Dried bush meat and cassava balls, enough to last 3 days. A small gourd of water. Most crucially, a small, clay palm oil lamp with enough oil for a night's exploration. One moonless night, when the village was swallowed by the deep, tranquil sleep that only comes after total exhaustion, I made my way to the riverbank. The air was cool, and the water was dark, a black, oily expanse that seemed to whisper the names of the lost. I could feel the ancestral fear, trying to hold me back, a thick, psychological chain around my ankle. Every step felt like a violation of everything I had been taught, but I forced myself forward. I had tracked the perfect crossing spot, a massive, ancient Irako log that had fallen during the sign storm 10 years earlier. It had drifted and settled, forming a treacherous, natural bridge across a narrow, shallower stretch of the river. I stepped onto the slick, moss-covered log. My heart was not pounding. It was a furious, muffled drumbeat in my chest. I moved with the silent, balanced grace of a predator, my focus absolute. The current rushed beneath me, a hungry, roaring sound that threatened to pull me into the depths. When I reached the other side, I didn't move for a full 5 minutes. I stood there, expecting the immediate wrath of the water god, waiting for the lightning to strike me, the earth to open up, or the vengeful spirit of Mamandiomi to appear and kill me for my disobedience. Nothing happened. The forest was silent. The night was calm. The only movement was the soft, natural rustle of leaves. The only sound was the pulse of the water. In that moment, standing on the forbidden bank, the fear that had ruled my life and my village for a decade shattered. It was the most liberating, terrifying realization of my life. The curse might be nothing more than fear and superstition. The river was just a river. The god, if it existed at all, was silent and unimpressed. I walked deeper into the forbidden forest, following the faint, familiar sounds I had been hearing for months. The easy Iomi was unlike the forest around Yazumura. It was thicker, wilder, the canopy denser, the earth soft and spongy underfoot. I pressed on, using the star positions and the subtle slope of the ground to guide me, relying on the training that was now saving my life. After about 2 hours of intense, silent walking, a true hunter's crawl through the bush, I saw a light ahead, a faint orange glow, like a muffled firelight, shielded by a dense cluster of towering mahogany trees. I moved closer, carefully, silently. I found a dense patch of ferns and crawled to the edge, parting the leaves to see through. It was a fortress, a functional, well-established settlement hidden deep in the forbidden forest. A large compound with at least a dozen structures, crude sleeping quarters, a communal cooking area, a larger central house, and storage sheds. It was surrounded by a tall, intimidating fence made of tightly woven bamboo and reinforced with spikes. This was not the spiritual abode of a deity. This was a human settlement designed for long-term isolation and defense. I climbed a huge silk cotton tree near the perimeter fence to get a better, safer view. I settled on a thick branch, my muscles taut with anticipation and dread. What I saw inside the compound made my stomach turn cold. Dozens of women, Young women, pregnant women, women carrying babies. They were moving about, performing domestic chores under the dim light of lanterns, grinding corn, tending the fire, washing clothes in large wooden buckets. They were dressed in dull, shapeless wrappers, their movements slow and heavy. There was no joy in their labor, only the blank acceptance of a life that had been stolen. My eyes scanned the compound until they locked onto the figure at the center of the operation. There he was, sitting on a high, elaborately carved wooden chair, like a king presiding over his dominion. Akbara, the priest we thought was dead. He was significantly larger now. His skin looked well-oiled, his head shaved smooth. He wore not the simple white of a priest, but the rich, embroidered blue and gold of a tribal chief. He was surrounded by two younger men, his sons, whom I recognized instantly, and several other large, muscular men carrying crude wooden clubs, clearly serving as guards. I watched for hours, absorbing the horrific tableau. The truth was not just clear, it was physically painful, a searing heat of fury running through my veins. Akbara hadn't died. He had staged his death to escape the tedious public rituals and scrutiny of the village. He had relocated his operation here, deep inside the Easy Iomi, establishing his own hidden, self-sufficient kingdom. And all those girls who had been offered to the river god over the past 10 years, 200 from Yuzumura, plus hundreds more from other communities, they weren't brides of a god, they were prisoners. Akbara's personal stock. He had been taking them, keeping them here, forcing them to bear his children and the children of his inner circle, building his own twisted dynasty of stolen innocence in the Forbidden Forest while our village suffered and died for his lie. I moved from the observation tree and circled the compound, needing physical proof. I peeked into one of the main structures, which was clearly a dormitory. My heart shattered. Inside were about 50 women, lying on mats, heavily pregnant or holding infants. They looked tired, hopeless, and above all broken. Some I recognized: Fumna, who had been taken 7 years ago, Ogo, who was supposed to have married my cousin. The weight of their wasted years was a crushing, invisible force in that room. I moved to another building, then another. There were close to 500 women in total, a testament to the scale of his evil. He hadn't just been taking girls from Yuzumura, he was running an organized cult of kidnapping and enslavement, spreading the same lie about angry river gods to multiple communities, collecting girls from different places to maintain genetic diversity and a constant workforce. I finally found Akbara's main house, the larger, central building. I crept close to the window, the mud walls pressing against my face. There he was, sitting at a table with his two sons, eating a large, steaming meal of roasted goat and pounded yam, drinking palm wine from a brass cup. They were talking, casually joking, completely relaxed, the picture of domestic, patriarchal bliss built on the suffering of 500 women. And then I heard the words that provided the final, undeniable piece of the criminal conspiracy. One of the young men, Akbara's son, named Jide, said, leaning back with a satisfied smirk, "Father, the new batch of girls from Agbor village will arrive next week. 10 of them, all virgins just as you requested. We'll add them to the collection." Emika's men did a good job of creating a panic there. Akbar laughed, a wet, self-satisfied rumble. "Good, very good. The more women we have, the stronger our lineage becomes. We are self-sufficient here. We have food, we have water, we have women. In 20 years, we will emerge and tell the world we are the true ancestors of this region. We will have our own kingdom here, our own people, and no one will ever know the true foundation." It was all a game to him, a sick, evil game of empire building. He wasn't serving any god. He was building a new wicked genesis, a dynasty founded on deceit, fear, and human bondage. The river god was merely a front corporation for his criminal enterprise. I had the proof. I had the knowledge. The word Agbor confirmed that this was a multi-village conspiracy. I had to leave. I had to go back to Yuzumura and set fire to this lie before another 10 girls were stolen from Agbor. I turned to sneak back out of the compound. My mind was reeling from the 500 faces of despair, the sight of Akbara's wicked prosperity, the knowledge that I was standing in the heart of a 15-year-old deception. And then, in the darkness, I made the mistake of the exhausted hunter. I stepped on a dry, brittle cassava branch that had fallen near the side of the house. It snapped. The sound was deafening in the heavy silence. Akbara's son, Jide, who had been laughing moments before, froze instantly. He was a hunter's son after all. He shouted, "Who's there? Show yourself." I didn't hesitate. I ran. I crashed through the compound, heading for the fence. I heard shouts behind me, men scrambling for their weapons. Akbar's other son, Kalu, yelled, "Stop him." He saw the women. "Don't let him cross the river." I reached the weak spot in the bamboo fence, the section where the wood had rotted. I threw my body through the opening, the splintered wood tearing long gashes into my arms and back. I squeezed through just as one of the guards reached me. He grabbed my left leg with a powerful, desperate grip. I was trapped halfway in and halfway out, the guard pulling me back towards the prison. I kicked backwards, a desperate, furious movement connecting with his face. I heard the sickening crunch of bone and felt his grip instantly release. I scrambled free, pulling the ripped cloth of my trousers with me, leaving a trail of blood and torn fabric on the ground. I ran through the forest like a man possessed, the sounds of my pursuers, Akbar's sons and guards, close behind. They knew the forest better than I did now, having lived there for years, and they were closing the gap. I could hear their heavy breathing, the curses they shouted in our village dialect. Branches cut my face, thorns tore my clothes. But the pain was a secondary sensation, a distant echo to the white-hot terror of being caught and silenced forever. I reached the riverbank, the same treacherous crossing point. I didn't stop. I jumped into the dark water, not looking back, swimming across with all my strength. The current was strong, fast-moving, and it dragged me downstream, pulling me toward a thick cluster of dangerous submerged rocks. I fought it, churning my legs and arms, fueled by the hundreds of eyes I had just seen in the dark chamber. I finally reached the Uzumra bank and climbed out, collapsing on the wet mud, gasping for air. I lay there, retching, my whole body trembling with cold and shock. When I looked back, my pursuers had stopped. They were standing at the opposite riverbank, shouting, their torches held high. But they were not attempting to cross. They couldn't. They were afraid of breaking their own rule. They were afraid of the curse they had invented. Akbara had instilled the fear of the Easy Iomi so deeply that his own guards were paralyzed by the lie, unable to step into the water they had claimed was sacred, lest the river god punish them. The great, wicked irony of the lie saved my life. I had been saved by their own superstition. I rested for only a minute, collecting my wits and the precious, damning information I carried. I was alive, and I had the truth. The next morning, I did not go to my family's hut. I went straight to the Irako tree in the village square. I stood in front of everyone, dripping wet, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes hanging in shreds, a wild, terrifying figure. The noise of the village died down as they saw me. I stood there until a small crowd had gathered, my father among them, his face etched with confusion and worry. I didn't speak of the river god. I spoke of Akbara. I told them everything. I spoke for 30 minutes, recounting the 10 years of lies, the sealed coffin, the sounds in the forest, the perilous crossing, the underground chamber, the 500 women, the stolen babies, and the laughing king on his carved chair. At first, the reaction was denial, laced with superstitious terror. "Blasphemy!" shouted Emeka, the new priest, shaking his head violently. "The god will strike you down. You lie, Ahmad. You insult the dead." "He is mad," muttered an old woman, backing away slowly. "The Easy Iomi has driven him insane." My father, Musa, stood paralyzed. He saw the fire in my eyes, the truth in the desperate conviction of my voice, but the habit of fear was 15 years deep. "Show us, Ahmad," my father finally said, his voice quiet, heavy with doubt. "If you are telling the truth, you must show us the lie." I knew the word of a hunter, no matter how honest, was not enough. I knew I needed to appeal to the deeper, older, more pragmatic core of Uzumra's character. I will take you across the river, I said, pointing an injured, shaking arm toward the water. I will take anyone who has the courage to follow. But let me ask you this. Why did Akbra's guards stop at the riverbank last night? I then revealed the final piece of the logic puzzle. They were chasing me, men with clubs, angry men who wanted to kill me to keep the secret. Yet they did not cross a small stream to silence a single unarmed man. Why? Because the lie they told you, they also told themselves. They are afraid of the river god, the phantom god they invented. A true river spirit would have struck me dead the moment I stepped onto the log. It did not. The only curse that exists is the one Akbara placed upon your minds. The logic, cold and sharp, sliced through the fear. The elders who had secretly resented Akbara's expanding wealth and the injustice of the sacrifice began to nod slowly. The young men who had lost sisters and struggled to find wives looked at each other with a sudden, dangerous realization. A group of 50 men, including my father, whose face had finally shifted from doubt to cold, white fury, agreed to follow me. They gathered their weapons, farming machetes, sturdy wooden spears, hunting bows, and heavy, carved walking sticks. This was not a ritual procession, it was a war party. We crossed the river together, this time not in silence and fear, but with a low, unified murmur of purpose. The sun was fully up, its light cutting through the canopy, giving us strength. When we reached the Easy Iomi bank, my father took the lead, his ancient hunting spear held out. The fear of the god was gone, replaced by the sacred rage of a betrayed parent. We marched through the forest quickly, covering the distance in less than an hour. When we reached the clearing, we did not sneak. We were done with shadows. The moment Akbara's guards saw us, 50 men, armed and silent, emerging from the supposedly forbidden bush, they were paralyzed by the impossibility of the sight. The lie had failed them. We broke down the bamboo fence in a few swift, furious chops, the sound of splintering with the first true sound of justice Yazumura had heard in 15 years. We stormed the compound. Akbara and his sons Jide and Kalu were momentarily confused. Then they quickly grabbed their own weapons, rusty machetes and heavy pieces of lumber. They tried to fight back, launching themselves at the first men through the breach. The fighting was brutal but short. It was not a battle between soldiers, it was a desperate clash between criminals and grieving fathers. Akbara was strong, a mountain of well-fed muscle, but the collective, righteous anger of the villagers was a force no single man could withstand. My father, Musa, went straight for Akbara. He did not use his spear. He threw the weapon aside and tackled the priest, shouting, "My daughters! You took my people's daughters." They wrestled on the dusty ground, the man who preached faith fighting the man whose faith had been destroyed. I rushed to help my father, and together we overpowered the wicked priest. Akbara and his inner circle, his 2 sons and 4 main guards, were quickly subdued and tied up with our hunting ropes, their expensive clothes torn and covered in mud. The remaining guards fled into the bush, scattering into the jungle they knew so well. The men immediately set to freeing the women. The first few structures were quickly opened, and the women inside stepped out into the daylight for the first time in months or years. Their reaction was not immediate joy, but a cautious, silent confusion. "Where is the river god?" One woman asked, her eyes wide with fear, thinking we were new, more terrible keepers. "There is no river god, sister," my father told her gently, his voice thick with tears. "Only us. You are safe. You are going home." I led a small group of men to the entrance of the underground chamber, the catacomb. As they stood at the opening, I heard the same gasps of horror, the same collapse of disbelief that I had experienced hours before. The 500 women in the cavern were freed slowly. It took hours. We had to carry the pregnant women and those too weak to walk. We had to comfort the mothers and secure the 100 or more small children who had never seen the sky before. The scene was one of impossible chaos and profound pathos. We helped them into the light, each woman an echo of a life lost and now tentatively retrieved. Some of the women were too traumatized to speak, others cried uncontrollably. Their disorientation was painful to watch. They were free, but they were not whole. I recognized a handful of women from my village, girls I had watched leave as a boy. I found Adana, the girl from the first offering. She was now a thin, haunted woman in her late 20s, holding a toddler. She looked at me, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, and then she looked away, unable to process the decade of her stolen life. We gathered the evidence. Akbara's large cache of stolen goods, the finest food, the embroidered robes, and a large leather-bound book containing detailed records. The book listed the names of hundreds of girls, the villages they came from, Yuzamara, Agbor, Ndoki Mwahia, and others, and the dates they were offered. It was a cold, clinical ledger of human crime. We burned that evil compound to the ground. We burned the sheds, the dormitories, the kitchen, and Akbara's throne. The smoke rose into the jungle canopy, a dark, cleansing signal that the lie was dead. Akbara and his captured men were dragged back across the river, back to Yuzumara. They were tied to the Irako tree where the lie had begun, and the entire community gathered to witness their judgment. Emeka, the puppet priest, was in hysterics, babbling apologies and claiming innocence. Akbara, however, was unrepentant. The village elders, the ones who had been Akbara's compliant executors, began the trial. They confronted him with the list, with the testimony of the rescued women, and with their own personal grief and shame. Akbar confessed everything. He admitted that he had invented the curse, that he had faked the signs and wonders, that the storm was timed with his sons using loud powder charges across the river, and that he had taken the girls for himself and his emerging dynasty. Why? My father demanded, his voice shaking. Why did you destroy our village? Why did you make us sacrifice our own? Akbara looked around at the faces of his former flock, his expression not of shame, but of arrogant contempt. I gave you people something to believe in, he sneered, spitting on the ground. I gave you purpose. You were too weak, too simple to build a great nation. You needed a demanding God to keep you focused. I was your God. I took your best to make my line strong. You should be thanking me for saving you from your own pathetic existence. Those were his last words of reason. He showed no remorse, only a towering, insane pride in his monstrosity. The village elders, led by my father, Musa, and the few remaining honest men, unanimously sentenced him and his sons to death. Akbara was executed that same day, his reign of terror ending exactly where it began, beneath the shade of the great Irako tree. The justice was swift, brutal, and necessary. The moment of the raid was the climax of the story, but the true labor began afterward. The return to Yuzumara was not a triumphant parade, it was a procession of wounded souls. The immediate aftermath was pure, overwhelming complexity. The hundreds of women and children, the survivors, represented a human disaster of epic proportions. Many were reunited with their families after years of absence. The joy was mixed with agony. Mothers wept over daughters who were no longer the girls they remembered. Some parents who had moved away years ago returned, shocked and tearful. Many women, especially those taken from other villages like Agbor or Ndoki, had no homes to return to. Their families had assumed them dead or had moved on. They stayed in Yuzumara, temporary refugees in a village that had been their indirect jailer. The children born in the compound, the children of the lie, presented the deepest moral and social problem. They were the offspring of Akbara and his guards, but they were innocent victims. Yuzumara had to decide, would they accept these children as their own, or would they allow the priest's evil to continue through their lives? The elders decided that they would be raised as Yuzumara's children, their parentage a sad secret, their future a shared community responsibility. My father, Musa, took a personal interest in ensuring their safety and integration. It's been 10 years since we rescued those women from Akbar's compound. Yuzumara slowly recovered, but the scars remain deep and lasting. The trauma was systemic. Many women never fully recovered from the mental and physical abuse. They suffered from profound emotional numbness, deep depression, and an inability to trust. Yuzumura, a village of farmers and hunters, had no psychologists. Our healing was done through community. The rescued women formed a powerful, unbreakable sisterhood. They relied on each other, sharing their memories and grief, providing the only truly safe space for healing. The traditional rituals were completely rewritten. The river god was no longer feared. The river was now simply a resource. The new focus of the community's faith became truth and vigilance. We established a new council, partly composed of the recovered women, to oversee all spiritual and community matters, ensuring no single voice could ever again claim absolute authority. People who had left during the curse came back, drawn by the incredible, miraculous truth of the rescue. Young couples started having children again, and this time, the births were celebrated with unfiltered joy, not shadowed by dread. We took the recovered women and children and settled them in the empty homes that had been abandoned during the curse. They were given land and resources to start farming, slowly knitting the frayed edges of the community back together. The wealth that Akbara had amassed, the cattle, the bags of grain, the fine cloth, was all confiscated and distributed equally among the recovered women and the remaining families, serving as a material apology from the community. But the true cost remains visible in the quiet moments. Some of the women, like Adamu, never integrated back into Yuzumura life. They were too damaged by the memories, too burdened by the children born in the lie. They eventually left, seeking anonymity in the larger cities, a silent reminder that freedom is not always the same as repair. Some families could never forgive themselves for allowing their daughters to be taken in the first place, or for participating in the desperate acts that led to tragedies like Chioma's. The guilt of that 15-year-long compliance is a sorrow that will pass through generations. I am telling you this story because it needs to be told and retold. Evil doesn't always come with horns and fire, demanding your attention with a spectacular display of malice. Sometimes it comes dressed in religious robes, speaking the comforting language of tradition, wearing a mask of piety and wisdom. It uses your faith as a weapon against you, turning your deepest beliefs into the chains of your own enslavement. If you don't question, if you don't think, if you don't measure the supposed divine demand against your own conscience and the observable reality of injustice, you will become a slave to lies. The most dangerous cult leader is the one who appears most trusted. The lesson here is simple and must be written on the heart of every person who hears this story. Never let fear stop you from seeking the truth. Fear is the fertile soil where lies take root and thrive. Never let tradition blind you to injustice. Tradition is a guide, not a jailer. When it demands cruelty, it has been corrupted. Never let anyone, not even a priest, not even an elder, use religion to control you or harm others. The divine cannot be served by human suffering. And, most importantly, when something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. The hunter's eye knows when the tracks lie. The heart knows when the ritual demands too much. Speak up. Investigate. Fight back. Because silence is what allows evil to thrive. My name is Ahmad. I'm a hunter. And I hunted down the biggest lie ever told to my people. May we never be deceived again, and may the true spirit of Yuzumura, rebuilt on the foundation of difficult truth, endure forever. This is my story. Tell me the country and time you are watching me. Share your take on the story. Thank you for giving me your time. Stay safe, stay vigilant.